Welcome back to A Little Bit of Philosophy. This is Philosophy 101, Unit 3, Lecture 5, Part 2, David Hume's Objections to the Teleological Argument. In our last video, we looked at the most celebrated version of the teleological argument proposed by William Paley. His analogical argument is built upon our ability to recognize the distinction between natural and artificial phenomena. The difference we empirically observe is that the natural phenomena lacks qualities that we observe in artifacts. If we're walking through nature and trip on a rock, we don't ask, who put that rock there? But if we stumbled upon a watch upon the ground, it would be quite rational to ask about its origins. The disanalogy between these two phenomena lies in the fact that one demonstrates design while the other doesn't. But when we step back and consider nature as a whole, Paley argues that it more closely resembles the watch than other natural phenomena. Since the universe is like a machine, in that it demonstrates design, there must be some intelligent agent to have designed and made it. We use the word God to refer to such a being, so we can say that God, the universe maker, exists. Now, the core idea behind the analogy is not just that the universe is orderly, but it reflects, so he claims, a subset of order that requires an intentional agent. It reflects design, or telos in Greek. You can't have design without a designer. That's why we call this a teleological argument. And its simplicity helps us understand its broad appeal. It requires no deep metaphysical concepts, no distinctions between contingency or necessity. Just look around you. The cosmos is like a great big machine, and it fits in nicely with the new empirical theory of knowledge that had begun to dominate the modern worldview. It's sort of like a scientific argument for God's existence. You'll recall from our last video that the scientific revolution of the modern period actually began with the work of Copernicus during the Renaissance, but it was Galileo's telescopic confirmation of heliocentrism, a sun-centered universe, that really set things in motion. Just 50 years later, Isaac Newton would publish Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which demonstrated, through the newly discovered method of the calculus, the mechanical rules governing all motion in the universe, what we now call classical mechanics. It was inevitable that the same tools that helped explain the cosmos would also be used to explain other observable phenomena, like biological organisms. Now, the medieval worldview held that species had been fixed in their current form since the moment of creation, but the idea that species changed over time would gradually increase in popularity until Charles Darwin finally discovered the mechanism by which species could change over time. In fact, prior to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859, the idea of biological evolution was already widely accepted. It was the mechanism of change that was unknown until Darwin. And many held that the process of evolution itself was evidence of divine providence, since something must be guiding the process of adaptation to the observable conclusions that we see in the world around us. But the mechanical model of the universe wasn't just the byproduct of the new science. It was also being promoted in the philosophical traditions of the modern period. Long before Newton or Darwin, René Descartes' works on optics and neurophysiology had already laid out the foundations of a mechanical worldview. His theory of knowledge, however, was hopelessly tied to a dualistic metaphysical view, and would come to be replaced by John Locke's masterpiece, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1689, which laid out the theoretical foundations for the newly emerging scientific method. In light of all of this, it should not be surprising that William Paley's argument, resting as it does on the idea that the universe is a giant machine, would fit right in with the times. But unbeknownst to Paley, John Locke's successor in epistemology, David Hume, had already devastated the argument, and indeed the whole field of natural religion, in his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, published posthumously in 1779, a full 20 years before Paley wrote his argument. David Hume is one of the three great British empiricists, along with John Locke and George Berkeley. And in his epistemological work, he had argued that taking John Locke's empirical hypothesis seriously, that all ideas are derived from the senses, forces us to accept that knowledge of the empirical world is impossible, at least as it was traditionally defined as true justified belief. There is simply no way to sufficiently bridge the gap between the objective world external to our minds and our subjective beliefs about it. He doesn't doubt or deny that there is an external world. He merely claims that we will never be able to have sufficient knowledge of what it's like. Therefore, metaphysics, the attempt to understand the nature of reality itself, is a dead end. And this same doubt about the external world also extends to the existence of God. Perhaps God exists, then again perhaps not, but what's for sure is that we cannot know whether God does or doesn't exist. Around 1750, Hume began writing a critical examination of the whole tradition of natural religion in what would become the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which would ultimately be published 3 years after his death. Throughout these dialogues, the three main characters, Philo, Cleanthes, and Demea, would alternately explore and raise objections to all of the major arguments for God's existence. In the selection I've provided in your textbook, you have the passages relevant to the teleological argument. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Hume is not objecting to Paley specifically, since the latter hadn't yet even written his version of the argument. And the fact that Paley doesn't attempt to address any of Hume's criticisms indicates that he didn't read Hume's book. He thus becomes an object lesson for all students from that time to the present. Do thorough research before you write your magnum opus. There are three main characters in Hume's dialogues, Demea, Cleanthes, and Philo. Demea, whose name derives from the Greek word demos, which refers to ordinary or common people, that is, those who are not elite, defends the a priori ontological argument. He likes the certainty of the conclusion which follows rationally from the properties necessary to a divine being. Cleanthes, on the other hand, who's probably named after the famous Hellenistic philosopher who gives us the oldest surviving version of the teleological argument in the Western tradition, not surprisingly defends the teleological argument, which is being examined in the part of the text that you're reading. Philo, whose name derives from one of the Greek words for love, is the skeptic, and finds neither the a priori nor the a posteriori approach satisfying. His position, as you would expect, is anything but dogmatic, but he tends to fall into rather what we would call the agnostic category, dubious that we can know much of anything for certain regarding God's existence. We open with Cleanthes laying out the argument for us. He says, "Look round the world. You'll find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human designs, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since, therefore, the effects resemble each other, we're led to infer by all the rules of analogy that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties. By this argument a posteriori, and by this argument alone, do we prove at once the existence of a deity and his similarity to the human mind and intelligence." Now, Demea immediately objects to the fact that Cleanthes is trying to establish the existence of God using an inductive argument, since 1, the conclusion will not be certain, and 2, it diminishes the grandeur of the subject, and perhaps even the capacities of human intelligence. Philo, on the other hand, is not offended at using inductive reasoning for this subject matter, but rather that this particular inductive argument doesn't accomplish what Cleanthes thinks it does. Philo will raise 3 main objections to the teleological argument. First, he will show that the argument is actually a bad analogy, and therefore doesn't give us a conclusion that will be more likely than not. Second, he'll conclude that even if the analogy were strong, the conclusions that would then follow from the argument would not give us anything approximating the theistic deity that Cleanthes has in mind. In closing, he'll cast doubts on the whole project of attempting to establish knowledge of causation. Now, we'll take each of these objections in turn and begin with the nature of analogical arguments themselves. Before we proceed to Philo's specific objections, we should remind ourselves what an analogical argument looks like. Consider the following analogy. Here we have 2 animals. Both are 4-footed. Both are mammals. Both are of the equine family, and both are domesticated. These are things they share in common. Suppose we further know that horses eat grass, but we're not sure what donkeys eat. Can we conclude, based on the similarities between the cases, that it is likely that donkeys eat grass too? Yes, we'd be justified in inferring that donkeys also eat grass. But now let's consider a second analogy. When we consider the ostrich and the penguin, we discover that they are both bipedal, they are both birds, they're both flightless birds, and they're both wild animals. Let's further assume that we know that penguins eat fish. Based on the similarities, would we be justified to infer that ostriches eat fish? Notice that we have exactly the same basic set of similarities as we did in the first analogy, but of course, ostriches don't eat fish. Analogies can be tricky things. When we think about this form of inductive argument, we need to be cognizant not just of the similarities between the cases, but also the dissimilarities between them. Further, we also have to be concerned about the relevance of the similarities that we propose. After all, any 2 things can be compared and found to be alike in some ways. These are precisely the sort of objections that Philo raises to Cleanthes. There are certainly similarities between the universe and a machine. They are wholes made of parts, and the parts and their parts fit together to form the larger phenomenon. But there are also a great many dissimilarities between machines and the universe. First, we must acknowledge that humans, as machine makers, have a great deal of experience with the artifacts that we produce. Certainly, since the agricultural revolution, the human world is a world of machines. But when we compare our familiarity with artifacts with the universe as a whole, we find a greater disparity. Our experience is limited to one planet, much of which we've not yet explored and don't fully comprehend. And as we move out from Earth, we find an exponentially diminishing degree of familiarity and knowledge. And awareness of that gap in knowledge highlights a core informal fallacy in the teleological argument, known as the fallacy of composition. This fallacy occurs when we assume that what's true of the parts will also be true of the whole. Imagine you were putting together a sports team, and you recruited the very best players for each individual position on the team. Would it follow that because each member of the team was excellent at her position, that the whole team would also be excellent? Of course it doesn't. There are qualities that make for an exceptional team that are distinct from the qualities that make for an exceptional individual player. So when we project from our very limited knowledge of the world immediately around us to the cosmos as a whole, it is very likely that we are committing something like this fallacy, assuming that the parts that we observe and what's true of them must also be true of the whole. This leads us to another informal fallacy, which also lies at the heart of the teleological argument, the anthropocentric fallacy. Anthropocentrism is the fallacy of assuming the human point of view is objective. Since humans are, by nature, machine makers, it is tempting to project the human perspective on anything that's not human. The artifacts that humans make are the production of intentional design, that is, the adaptation of means to ends. But does it follow that all adaptation is the consequence of intention? It is certainly the case that human inventions are designed, but the anthropocentric fallacy would project this same intentionality onto all such adaptation. If there were alternative explanations of how order might emerge in the universe independent of intentional design, then it would be fallacious to assume that the complex ordering of phenomena we observe must be the product, or is even very likely to be the product, of an intentional agent, which is exactly what the teleological argument concludes. Given these facts, it would be hasty at best and fallacious at worst to conclude that the cause of the universe is an intentional agent, anything like a human being. This leads us to Philo's second and far more devastating critique of Cleanthes's argument. If we were somehow able to find our way around the objections already noted and conclude that the universe was the product of design, the very inductive reasoning we use to establish the universe as a machine would force us to conclusions that no theist would be willing to accept. So far as our knowledge extends, only humans are machine makers. So if the universe is a machine, and therefore the product of intelligent design, we would be forced to conclude that the universe maker would be like the machine makers we know, that is, like humans. From this conclusion, a whole host of undesirable qualities would have to be ascribed to the maker of the universe. Now, theists like to attribute to God a host of infinite properties like omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence, but we know of no machine makers that are infinite in power, or knowledge, or moral reliability. So why should the maker of the universe have any of these qualities? In fact, when we consider complex machines, one fact we inevitably encounter is a distinction between those who do the design work and those who do the manufacturing. In fact, there seems to be a direct link between level of complexity and the division of design and construction we find in machines. Given the vast complexity of the universe, the analogy upon which the argument for God's existence rests would force us to infer that the being responsible for the design of the cosmos would be distinct from the being responsible for its construction. Further, there would be no reason to stop at dualism, since the very same complexity that requires a distinction between designer and builder would force us to accept a host of designers and builders. After all, the more complex a machine is, the greater the need for multiple agents to produce the artifact. This recognition could also help explain the seeming incompleteness of the universe. This might be the product of a group of infant or geriatric deities who failed to get the job done right. Indeed, it would also seem to follow from the analogy that this universe is only one in a large number of machines that have been and likely will be created by these universe makers. Finally, have you ever met a machine maker that didn't have a body? If the analogy was indeed a strong analogy, that very analogy would force us to conclude that the gods are corporeal in nature. So, if we were able to establish a strong analogy between the universe and a machine, we would simultaneously be forced to conclude not a being that corresponds with the theistic definition of God, but rather a host of finite, corporeal beings that have long since ceased to exist. If the teleological argument works, which it doesn't, it would be an argument against theism. So, Philo continues, what can we conclude about the universe based on our empirical observations? Well, we can conclude that there are some similarities between the order we observe in nature and the order we observe in machines, but we cannot establish that this order is design as we understand it. And if we were able to establish strong evidence of design in the natural phenomena of the universe, we would have no reason to conclude the existence of a being anything like the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and singular being posited by theism. In fact, the argument would force us to conclude the existence of a host of non-theistic designers and manufacturers of the universe. Philo's final objection is a reflection of Hume's general skepticism toward the idea of causation itself. In his Inquiries Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1777, Hume argued that any attempt to establish knowledge of causation in the observable world was substantially flawed. You've undoubtedly heard someone say that correlation is not the same as causation. This distinction was established by Hume in his careful analysis that our limited point of view only allows us to observe the flow of events in time. Certainly, we observe patterns of correlation among events in the world, but to say that we have observed the correlation of events over time is not the same as saying that we have discovered causation in the world. We cannot observe causation. We only observe the events in time. And as an empiricist, Hume is loath to admit ideas that do not rest on observation or are the product of the relationship between ideas in the mind. To put it more plainly, empiricism forces us to be skeptical about what's going on in the world itself, separate from our observations of those events. Philo will go on to suggest that perhaps we discover a stronger analogy between the universe and a natural organism, something like a great cosmic plant that indeed contains adaptation of means to ends within it, but not an artifact, the product of some transcendent, singular intelligence. To summarize what we've discovered in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, we've found that the teleological argument is an analogical argument which, in itself, can only establish conclusions with a degree of probability, which is precisely why Demea found it so objectionable. He thought that if we were going to argue for God's existence, then we should use deductive arguments, which can yield necessary conclusions. Philo points out that the analogy at the heart of the argument is weak and cannot establish the conclusion that the universe is a machine, which demonstrates design in its adaptation of means to ends. He further argues that even if the analogy did work, it would be an argument against theism, since the cause of the universal machine would have to be like other machine makers we know of, and this is a conclusion that no self-respecting theist would be willing to accept. Finally, Philo points out that any attempt to establish causation among observable phenomena must be undertaken with the utmost caution, since empiricism does not allow us to establish knowledge of causation among our observations. Of course, the teleological argument remains one of the most popular arguments among theists for God's existence, which you might have encountered as the argument from intelligent design. But even serious contemporary proponents of the argument have not been able to answer all of Hume's criticisms. In fact, as Hume's dialogues became more widely read and understood, there was a marked decline of interest in the whole project of natural religion. Of course, Hume's arguments against knowledge of causation would also have a profound impact beyond philosophy and beyond natural religion. Most notably, the project of establishing scientific knowledge in any strong sense would be undermined by Hume's work. This would lead Immanuel Kant to attempt a synthesis of rationalism and empiricism a generation later. And by the 20th century, the American pragmatist movement would ultimately try to redefine knowledge itself in an attempt to allow for and explain scientific progress. But we have to deal with Kant and the pragmatists another time. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and be sure to come back again to learn a little bit of philosophy.